The Windermere Theatre carried its age in a softened hush. Velvet that had absorbed decades of applause, dust that was not dirt but memory, guilt that had mellowed from ostentation into gentle resilience. In the stalls, where the house lights were lowered to a waxen wash, and the stage glowed with the amber of approaching evening, Inspector Alleyn sat with his long hands folded and watched the rehearsal prepare to begin. There were voices without bodies, and bodies without voices, the curious theatrical business of other people's lives assembling into something that might, with luck and artifice, resemble art. He had been invited by Lady Cosima Windermere, who liked to suppose that the presence of an eminent policeman brought a certain cachet to her philanthropic endeavours. "Do come, Inspector," she had said over the telephone. "It's only a rehearsal, so the alarming parts will be soothed by incompetence. Besides, dear Vivian's play is said to draw rather too closely from life. You might find it professionally illuminating." Alleyn had smiled at that and said he would be charmed. The word had amused her considerably. Now she rustled into his row, paused with a proprietary air and laid a cool, gloved hand on the back of the seat before him. "The piece is called The Velvet Bridge," she murmured. "A charity performance for the Actors' Benevolent Fund. You perceive the symbolism, I'm sure." Alleyn looked toward the stage. The set suggested a nocturne. A crescent of bridge swept across the boards, not structural but ornamental, draped in midnight velvet and picked out with silver pins of starlight. Beneath it, a still pond devised by paint and clever lighting waited with disconcerting patience. A door in a painted pavilion promised entrance to discretion. On the bridge itself, a lamp like a pearl hung from a slender stem, casting a pool of light that seemed both inviting and treacherous. "One crosses and is transformed," said Alleyn quietly. "Or so the author hopes." "The author hopes for more practical transformations," Lady Cosima replied with a slight edge to her voice. "A West End run would suit him admirably. Julian Harcourt directs, that is to say, he commas and elides poor Vivian into theatrical sense. The playwright himself is present, though one rather wishes he weren't quite so obviously wounded by each suggested alteration." The stage lights brightened and shadows became suddenly explicit. The company drifted into position with that half-ceremonial self-absorption of those who must presently become other people. A tall, hawk-faced man in black with a silk scarf knotted about his throat like elegant irony stood at the footlights and clapped his hands softly. "Places for Act 2, called Julian Harcourt, his voice carrying the particular authority of one accustomed to being obeyed in matters of artistic interpretation. We'll run the confrontation scene and the final movement. Mr. Thorne, you will not alter a single syllable until I have demonstrated precisely why you must. Miss Vale, my dear, remember the bridge represents your character's moral awakening. Don't attempt to mount it as you would a stile in the Shires." Alleyn's attention sharpened as he observed the assembled players. Vivian Thorne, the playwright, sat hunched in the third row, with a manuscript clutched against his chest and his face bearing the particular pallor of artistic anxiety. He was a man of perhaps 35, with the aesthetic sensibility that marked him as unmistakably theatrical, yet there was something in his posture, a defensive tension, that suggested his discomfort extended beyond mere opening night nerves. Eloan Gray emerged from the pavilion door, pale and singular under the pearl lamp, her rehearsal gown trailing shadows that seemed almost too deliberate. She possessed that particular composure which in actresses suggests profound restraint, and in other women might be mistaken for hauteur. "I am precisely where I am required to be," she said, her voice holding a thread of contralto steel that could, Alleyn suspected, stitch up a scene or slice through pretension with equal facility. Harcourt bowed with theatrical gallantry. "Then we, grovelling, shall endeavour to catch up. Mr. Varney, are you prepared?" Felix Varney stepped forward from the wings, handsome to the point of carelessness, with the sort of effortless charm that suggested he had never been required to develop depth. Yet as he looked at Eloan, Alleyn detected something that transcended mere professional interest, a watchfulness too intense to be casual admiration, too guarded to be innocent affection. In the stalls, other figures had arranged themselves with the careful casualness of those whose presence served multiple purposes. Mrs. Agatha Birkett, the wardrobe mistress, stood in the shadows with her pin-cushion like a badge of office, her eyes missing nothing. Sir Cedric Mordaunt, retired from military service and now serving on the theatre's board, occupied an aisle seat with the bearing of one perpetually inspecting invisible troops. Most intriguingly, Imogen Vale, Lady Cosima's protégée and the evening's ingénue, waited near the bridge with an expression of such transparent sincerity that it was almost painful to witness. She was very young, very earnest, and very much out of her depth among these seasoned performers. "Ready," said Harcourt, "and begin." The scene commenced with that peculiar mixture of artifice and truth that marks all theatrical endeavour. As the dialogue unfolded, Alleyn found himself observing not merely the performance but the performers, the way Elowen's restraint became more calculated with each repetition, how Felix's warmth seemed increasingly forced, and how young Imogen's sincerity remained stubbornly genuine despite all attempts at sophistication. But it was the playwright's behaviour that most arrested Alleyn's attention. Vivian Thorne sat rigid as his words were spoken, his knuckles white where they gripped his manuscript. When Harcourt suggested a line change, Thorne's sharp intake of breath was audible even in the back stalls, and when Elowen delivered a particular speech, something about secrets that bridged the gap between intention and action, Thorne's face went ashen, and his eyes fixed on Felix Varney with an intensity that spoke of recognition, accusation, and something very much like fear. During the interval, as the company drifted toward the foyer for tea, Lady Cosima leaned close to Alleyn. "You see how it is, Inspector. Vivian has written what he calls a work of fiction, but we who know the parties involved recognise it as something rather more dangerous. The bridge in his play, it's not merely symbolic. Last summer there was an incident. A young woman, a fall, circumstances that were never quite satisfactorily explained." Alleyn's grey eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "And the young woman?" "Recovered, thankfully. But the questions raised, well, they were never entirely put to rest, and now Vivian has chosen to resurrect them, dressed as art." Lady Cosima's voice carried a note of distaste. One wonders at his motives. In the foyer, beneath mirrors that had witnessed decades of theatrical triumphs and disasters, the company arranged itself with a careful choreography of people who knew each other too well. Elowen stood apart, accepting compliments with gracious detachment. Felix lounged against the mantelpiece with studied casualness, though his eyes followed Elowen's every movement. Imogen hovered uncertainly between groups, clearly conscious of her status as outsider. And Vivian Thorne sat alone in a corner, his manuscript still clutched in his hands, watching them all with the expression of a man who had set something in motion that he was no longer certain he could control. Alleyn, observing this tableau with the trained eye of one who had seen how civilized facades could crack under pressure, felt that familiar stirring of professional interest. The theatre, he reflected, was perhaps the perfect setting for murder, a place where artifice and reality blurred, where emotions ran high beneath polished surfaces, and where everyone was, by definition, playing a part. As the bell chimed for the second act, he settled back into his seat with the quiet satisfaction of a man who sensed that the evening's entertainment might prove more illuminating than anyone had anticipated. The velvet bridge awaited, bathed in its pool of treacherous light, and Inspector Alleyn found himself wondering who, before the night was through, might find themselves crossing it for the final time. The second act resumed with the particular quiet that follows interval, breath drawn not in anticipation but in the careful suspension of judgment. The pearl lamp cast its circle of light upon the velvet bridge, and beneath it the painted water waited with that patience peculiar to theatrical artifice. Alleyn settled back into his seat, aware that Lady Cosima beside him had acquired a tension that had not been present earlier. Julian Harcourt stood at the prompt corner, his silk scarf now slightly askew, as if the evening's earlier smoothness had suffered some imperceptible disturbance. "Places for the final movement," he called, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed, yet with an edge that suggested his composure required effort. Elowen Gray emerged from the pavilion door with her rehearsal gown trailing shadows that seemed almost too deliberate. She moved to the centre of the bridge, her hand coming to rest upon the lamp's slender standard, with a gesture that appeared both casual and possessive. The light caught the planes of her face, lending her the marble composure of a statue that might, at any moment, step down from its pedestal. "The crossing is made," she spoke, her voice carrying across the hushed theatre. What remains is to discover what waits on the other side. Felix Varney entered from stage left, his earlier casual charm now tempered by something more watchful. As he approached the bridge, Alleyn observed how his eyes moved not to Alohan's face but to her hand where it rested on the lamp standard. There was a quality to his attention that suggested recognition, or perhaps apprehension. In the third row, Vivian Thorne sat rigid, his manuscript clutched against his chest. The playwright's face had acquired a waxy pallor that made him appear almost spectral under the amber house lights. When Elowen delivered her next line, something about bridges built on foundations of deception, Thorne's sharp intake of breath was audible even to Alleyn. The scene progressed with that careful artifice that marks all theatrical endeavour, yet Alleyn found himself watching the spaces between the words, the glances that carried more weight than dialogue. Young Imogen Vale, waiting in the wings for her entrance, stood with her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white. Mrs. Birkett, the wardrobe mistress, had positioned herself near the prompt corner, her pincushion forgotten, her attention fixed on the stage with an intensity that spoke of more than professional interest. It was during Felix's soliloquy, a meditation on guilt and consequence, that Vivian Thorne rose from his seat. The movement was abrupt, almost convulsive, as if some internal spring had finally snapped. His manuscript scattered to the floor, pages drifting like autumn leaves, but he paid them no attention. Instead, he moved down the aisle with the peculiar determination of a man walking toward an appointment he both dreaded and desired. "Mr. Thorne," Harcourt called softly from the prompt corner, "if you would." But Thorne was already mounting the steps at the side of the stage. He moved past the wings, past the startled stage hands, and stepped directly onto the set. The actors, trained to continue, through almost any disruption, maintained their positions, though Alleyn saw Elowen's eyes flicker toward the playwright with something that might have been alarm. Thorne walked to the base of the velvet bridge and stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, as if gathering courage for some final irrevocable act. Then, with sudden decision, he grasped the lamp standard and began to pull himself up onto the bridge. The pearl lamp swayed under his weight, casting moving shadows across the painted backdrop. Elowen stepped back, her composure finally cracking. "Vivian," she said, her voice sharp with warning, "don't." But Thorne was beyond hearing. He stood now at the apex of the bridge, both hands gripping the lamp standard, his face turned upward toward the light as if seeking absolution or revelation. For a moment he remained perfectly still, a figure of such tragic intensity that even the seasoned company fell silent. Then the lamp flickered once, twice, and went out. In the sudden darkness there was a sound. Not a cry, but a soft, almost surprised exhalation. When the emergency lighting came up a moment later, Vivian Thorne lay crumpled at the base of the bridge, his body twisted at an angle that spoke of finality. The pearl lamp, its shade now dark and somehow accusatory, hung motionless above him. Alleyn was on his feet before the silence had fully settled. He moved with the fluid economy that had served him in more dangerous circumstances than theatrical mishaps. Reaching the stage as Harcourt called for the house lights, and someone in the company uttered a low, choked sound of distress. "No one touch anything," Alleyn said quietly, his voice carrying the particular authority of one accustomed to being obeyed in matters of life and death. He knelt beside Thorne's still form, set 2 fingers against the pulse point at the neck and felt nothing answer but cooling skin. There was a smell, faint but unmistakable, of something electrical, something burned. Alleyn's eyes moved to the lamp standard, noting the slight scorch mark at its base where the velvet drapery had been disturbed. The playwright's hands, he observed, bore small burns on the palms, and his face held the expression of a man who had found, in his final moment, not the revelation he sought, but a truth far more terrible. "He is dead," Alleyn announced, without ceremony and without emphasis. "Send for a doctor and for the manager. Until my people arrive, nothing must be altered." In the wings, Mrs. Birkett stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with what might have been shock or recognition. Felix Varney remained frozen at his position on the bridge, staring down at the body with an expression that combined horror with something that looked remarkably like relief. And young Imogen Vale, her earnest face now pale as parchment, whispered something that sounded like a prayer or perhaps an apology. Lady Cosima appeared at Alleyn's elbow, her usual, composure shaken. "Inspector," she murmured. I fear the evening has taken a turn none of us anticipated. Alleyn nodded, his grey eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The positioning of the body, the state of the lamp, the expressions on the faces around him. The velvet bridge, designed to symbolise transformation, had indeed witnessed a crossing. But this passage had been final, and the truth it revealed would require all of his considerable skill to uncover. The theatre, which had begun the evening as a place of artifice and entertainment, had become something far more serious. The scene of a crime that would test not only Alleyn's investigative abilities, but his understanding of the complex relationships that bound this company together in ways both professional and deeply personal. The particular hush that follows sudden death had settled over the Windermere Theatre like dust on velvet. Inspector Alleyn stood beside Vivian Thorne's still form, his hands clasped behind his back, allowing the silence to gather weight. He had learned long ago that silence was often more eloquent than questions, and in the suspended quiet that surrounded them, he could hear the small, involuntary sounds that revealed more than any formal statement. The whisper of fabric as someone shifted nervously, the barely audible intake of breath that suggested recognition, the faint creak of floorboards under the weight of guilt. Detective Sergeant Fox arrived with his customary quiet efficiency, followed by the police surgeon and a photographer, whose presence transformed the stage from a place of artifice into something grimly procedural. Alleyn nodded to Fox, then addressed the assembled company with the courteous authority that had served him well in drawing rooms far more elegant than this. "If you would be so good as to remain where you are for a few moments longer," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stage. "No one is to leave the theatre until we have had an opportunity to speak with each of you. Mr. Harcourt, might I impose upon you to arrange for the company to wait in the green room? I shall join you presently." Julian Harcourt, his silk scarf now completely dishevelled, nodded with the mechanical precision of a man seeking refuge in routine. "Of course, Inspector. Miss Partridge, if you would see to the arrangements." As the company began to disperse with the reluctant obedience of those who recognised authority, Alleyn turned his attention to the velvet bridge. The pearl lamp hung motionless now, its shade askew, casting no light but somehow drawing the eye with magnetic insistence. He approached it without touching, his trained gaze taking in every detail of the mechanism that had delivered death with such theatrical precision. "Mr. Phipps," he called to the stage manager, who had remained hovering near the prompt corner like a faithful retainer. "The lamp's electrical connection, where does it originate?" Phipps approached with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to technical inquiries. "Fixed wiring through the handrail tube, Inspector. Connects to the board through a junction under the stage. Clean installation. We had Grimsby & Sons do the work specifically for this production." Alleyn crouched to examine the base of the lamp standard, noting the slight scorch mark on the velvet where it had been in contact with the metal. The fabric showed not merely the compression of weight, but a subtle darkening, as if moisture had been absorbed and dried. He lifted his gaze to follow the line of the handrail, observing how the velvet drapery had been disturbed in places, showing contrary brush strokes in the nap. "During the interval," he said, still examining the bridge, "was anyone observed near this particular piece of equipment?" The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. It was young Imogen Vale who stepped forward, her earnest face flushed with the effort of speaking truth in circumstances that clearly terrified her. "I saw Mr. Thorne here during the interval," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had returned early to collect something from my dressing room, and he was standing by the lamp examining it very closely. When he noticed me, he stepped away quickly and said something about checking the stability of the set." Felix Varney, who had been leaning against the painted pavilion with studied casualness, straightened at this revelation. "Vivian was obsessive about every detail," he said, though his voice carried a forced lightness that did not escape Alleyn's notice. He'd been concerned about that lamp since rehearsals began, something about the symbolism requiring precise execution. Mrs. Birkett, who had remained in the wings like a watchful ghost, made a sound that might have been disagreement. When Alleyn's grey eyes settled on her with quiet encouragement, she lifted her chin with surprising dignity. "Begging your pardon, sir, but it wasn't symbolism that worried Mr. Thorne. It was fear." She glanced around the circle of faces, her expression suggesting she had already said more than was wise. There were things he'd written in that play, things drawn too closely from life, and there were those who didn't want certain truths brought to light. Elowen Gray, who had maintained her marble composure throughout the proceedings, spoke for the first time since the tragedy. Mrs. Birkett has an active imagination, she said, her contralto voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. Vivian was a playwright, not an investigative journalist. His work was fiction. Was it? Alleyn asked with deceptive mildness. He had moved to the props table visible through the nearest wing, where his trained eye had noted a roll of black insulating tape and a coil of fine copper wire, arranged with the neat precision of someone who understood electrical work. Lady Cosima mentioned an incident last summer. A young woman, a fool, circumstances never quite satisfactorily explained. I wonder if that incident bears any relation to the events depicted in Mr. Thorne's play. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Sir Cedric Mordaunt rising from his seat in the stalls with military bearing. "Inspector," he said, his voice carrying the authority of rank and breeding, "that particular matter was thoroughly investigated at the time. No charges were brought because no crime was committed. Yet Mr. Thorne felt compelled to revisit it in dramatic form," Alleyn observed. "One wonders why." He descended into the stalls to examine the scattered pages of Thorne's manuscript, gathering them with careful attention to their arrangement. The papers proved to be not the final script but an earlier draft, heavily annotated in the playwright's careful hand. The margins were filled with notes that seemed more personal than professional. E knows the truth. F cannot be trusted. The bridge must hold them all. Most intriguingly, the final page contained a handwritten edition that had not appeared in the performed version. Some crossings are made in darkness, and some bridges burn behind us. But guilt, like truth, casts its own light, and in that illumination, all masks fall away. Alleyn folded the manuscript carefully, his expression thoughtful. The playwright, it seemed, had intended his work to serve as more than entertainment. Whether his death represented the tragic conclusion to his own story, or merely the opening act in a drama far more complex, remained to be determined. "Sergeant Fox," he said quietly, "I should like a complete examination of the electrical system, particularly the lamp mechanism and its connections, every component, every wire, every junction point." He paused, his gaze returning to the velvet bridge where Thorne had made his final crossing. "And arrange for individual interviews with each member of the company. We shall begin with those who had the most intimate knowledge of Mr. Thorne's concerns." As the forensics team began their meticulous work, Alleyn reflected on the peculiar quality of the silence that surrounded them. It was not the silence of shock or grief, but of calculation, the silence of people who knew more than they were prepared to reveal, who were measuring how much truth they could afford to tell. The theatre, he mused, was indeed the perfect setting for such a drama, where artifice and reality blurred until even the participants could no longer distinguish between performance and truth. The velvet bridge waited in its pool of amber light, no longer a symbol of transformation, but a monument to the deadly precision with which human passions, when properly directed, could achieve their final, irrevocable effects. The green room at the Windermere Theatre possessed that particular melancholy, common to spaces designed for preparation rather than performance. Faded photographs of long-dead actors gazed down from walls, papered in a pattern that had once been fashionable, while worn velvet chairs arranged themselves around a table scarred by decades of nervous teacups and forgotten cigarettes. Inspector Alleyn entered this charged atmosphere with the quiet authority of one accustomed to finding truth in the spaces between words, settling himself in a chair that commanded a view of both door and window. Old habits from more dangerous circumstances than theatrical mishaps. He had arranged for the interviews to proceed with the methodical precision that had served him well in drawing rooms far more elegant than this. Julian Harcourt entered first, his silk scarf now perfectly retied, a small act of restoration that spoke of his need to impose order upon chaos. The director possessed that particular authority that comes from years of shaping other people's words into coherent meaning, yet beneath his professional composure, Alleyn detected the strain of a man whose careful orchestrations had been disrupted by forces beyond his control. "A dreadful business, Inspector," Harcourt began, his voice carrying the measured tones of one accustomed to being heard in the back rows. Vivian was always intense about his work. He had a tendency to blur the boundaries between life and art, sometimes to his own detriment. Alleyn leaned back slightly, allowing silence to gather weight between them. Lady Cosima mentioned that his current play drew rather closely from actual events. Would you concur? Harcourt's gaze drifted toward the window where afternoon light filtered through grimy glass. Vivian was a keen observer of human nature, certainly. The incident last summer, poor Margaret Thornfield's fall from the bridge at Sir Cedric's estate, it affected him deeply. He saw in it all the elements of classical tragedy: hubris, consequence, the terrible precision with which fate operates. Miss Thornfield was a member of your company? A dresser, and a promising one. She'd been with us for 2 seasons. Harcourt's voice carried a note of genuine regret. The accident occurred during Sir Cedric's annual house party for the company. Margaret had been celebrating rather enthusiastically, and when she decided to take air on the ornamental bridge, well, he gestured with elegant futility. She recovered, thankfully, though she never returned to theatrical work. Yet Mr. Thorne felt compelled to dramatise the incident. Harcourt's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Vivian was convinced there had been more to it than simple misadventure. He'd developed some rather elaborate theories about what had really occurred that evening. It had become quite uncomfortable, actually. His constant questions, his attempts to interview everyone who'd been present. When Harcourt departed, Alleyn made careful notes, recording not merely the director's words, but the careful way he had framed the incident as closed history, while acknowledging Thorne's persistent investigation. The playwright, it seemed, had been probing wounds that others preferred to leave undisturbed. Eloan Gray entered next with the controlled grace that marked her as unmistakably professional, settling into the still warm chair with fluid economy of movement. Yet Alleyn, whose trained eye had observed her earlier tremor, detected beneath her marble composure a tension that suggested her self-possession required considerable effort. "Miss Gray," he began with courteous formality, "you knew Mr. Thorne well?" "As well as one knows any playwright," she replied, her contralto voice carrying that particular precision actors develop when clarity is paramount. We had worked together before. He was passionate about his work, though not always wisely so. His passion extended beyond the purely artistic. Eloan's eyes flickered toward the faded photographs on the wall. Vivian had a tendency to see drama everywhere. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes he was merely intrusive. "The lamp on the bridge," Alleyn said with deceptive casualness. "You touched it during each rehearsal. For stability during the speech. Tonight it felt—" She paused, selecting words with surgical precision. "Different. Alive, somehow." Alleyn noted the faint tremor that passed through her right hand as she spoke, quickly withdrawn into her lap as if the movement had been an actor's calculated choice. Felix Varney arrived next, his earlier casual charm now tempered by circumstances that clearly unsettled him. He possessed that particular handsomeness that suggested he had never been required to develop depth. Yet as he settled into the chair, Alleyn detected beneath his surface confidence a watchfulness that spoke of more complex considerations. "Dreadful business," Varney began before Alleyn had spoken. "Poor Vivian, though I must say there was something almost inevitable about it. He'd been under tremendous strain recently, convinced that someone was actively working against him. Someone in particular?" Varney's gesture was elegant but vague. His suspicions seemed to centre on those of us who'd been present during Margaret Thornfield's accident. He'd convinced himself it hadn't been accidental, that someone had deliberately— Varney paused, recognising he had ventured onto dangerous ground. But of course, that was nonsense. The poor girl simply lost her footing. Yet Mr. Thorne persisted in his investigation. Obsessively. He'd been researching the incident for months, asking uncomfortable questions, trying to interview people. Some of us had begun to avoid him, frankly. Mrs. Birkett entered with the dignity of a woman who managed chaos with pins and patience, her practical bearing a refreshing contrast to the careful evasions of the previous witnesses. "I don't hold with disrespect to the dead," she said without preamble, "but I didn't like Mr. Thorne's way with private matters. Still, nobody deserved this. You mentioned earlier that you'd noticed something unusual about the electrical system. I keep a kettle in the corridor, Inspector. It tripped the fuse this afternoon for no reason I could see, and Mr. Phipps put it right. Only I had a feeling about that lamp. When I brushed the velvet earlier, the nap lay wrong along the handrail, like a cat that's been stroked against the grain. During the interval, did anyone approach the lamp besides Mr. Thorne?" Mrs. Birkett bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable with tale-bearing. "People come and go. Miss Partridge fetched a script. Mr. Varney smoked where he shouldn't. Sir Cedric walked the stage like a general inspecting the field. He put a hand to the rail, perhaps to test it. It looked natural, but then most things do until after. Sir Cedric Mordaunt took the chair with military bearing, his posture suggesting a man accustomed to command even in civilian circumstances. "You're entitled to ask, Inspector. I am entitled to answer as I see fit. Last summer's incident was thoroughly investigated at the time. No charges were brought because no crime was committed." Yet Mr. Thorne felt otherwise. "Mr. Thorne chose to peddle innuendo," Sir Cedric replied, his voice carrying the authority of rank and breeding. "If you insinuate I meddled with stage equipment, I have no patience. I know war, Inspector. I do not know wiring." Young Imogen Vale entered last, her earnest face flushed with the effort of speaking truth in circumstances that clearly terrified her. "I saw Mr. Thorne at the lamp during the interval," she said without prompting. "He was examining it very closely, murmuring to himself. When he noticed me, he started and said something about checking the stability of the set. Did he appear frightened?" "Very. He had an envelope, a heavy one, with a dark seal. He put it in his pocket when Mr. Varney came in." She looked down, then up with obvious effort. "In the foyer before the second act, I heard Sir Cedric say to Mr. Thorne, 'Withdraw it.' Mr. Thorne replied, 'It is already in rehearsal.' Sir Cedric said very quietly, 'Then remove the bridge,' and Mr. Thorne laughed, but it wasn't a nice sound." When the interviews concluded, Alleyn stepped into the corridor where Detective Sergeant Fox waited with his notepad and imperturbable air. The stage manager, Phipps, approached with his ring of keys and the bearing of a man whose professional competence had been called into question. "The electrical system, Mr. Phipps. You mentioned the lamp standard should have been safe." "Live to the fitting only, Inspector. The rail's earthed proper. Nothing should feed back to the metal." Phipps frowned, his professional pride clearly stung. Unless someone had stripped a wire and wrapped it where it oughtn't, and lifted or separated the earth connection, it would be cleverer than the usual bodge, and timed with the dimmer, it might arc just as the lamp went down. Alleyn exchanged a meaningful glance with Fox. The technical method was becoming clear, but the identity of someone with both the knowledge and opportunity to execute such precise sabotage remained tantalizingly obscure. "Well, Fox?" he asked as they walked back toward the stage. "Three say much, sir, and tell little. One says little and tells much." "Mrs. Birkett," Alleyn agreed, "and young Miss Vale blurts the shape of the thing without knowing its size." They paused at the edge of the stage where the velvet bridge lay under dead light, beautiful and somehow expectant. Alleyn put a hand to the rail and felt the faint roughness where fabric had been abraded, the ghost of heat in metal that should have been cool. The pattern was emerging with the slow precision of a photograph developing in chemical solution. Vivian Thorne had been more than a playwright seeking material. He had been an investigator pursuing justice for Margaret Thornfield's accident. His play had been intended not merely as entertainment but as exposure, a theatrical trial that would force the truth into the light. Someone in that carefully civilized company had recognized the threat and responded with the deadly precision that only intimate knowledge of both the victim and the venue could provide. The velvet bridge, designed to symbolize transformation, had indeed witnessed a crossing, but whether it represented justice served or justice perverted would require all of Alleyn's considerable skill to determine. The particular hush that follows revelation had settled into the deeper recesses of the Windermere Theatre, where Inspector Alleyn now pursued the threads of truth that servants and technicians weave with more honesty than their employers. The corridors beneath the stage possessed their own dignity, less velvet than the public spaces, but more substance, the honest architecture of those who made magic possible through skill rather than artifice. Detective Sergeant Fox accompanied him to the stage door, where Mr. Finch presided over his glass-panelled domain with the authority of 50 years' observation. The elderly keeper looked up from his ledger with eyes that had witnessed countless entrances and exits, triumphs and disasters, his face a road-map of theatrical history written in careful discretion. "Inspector," Finch said, setting aside his pen with the measured precision of one who recorded truth as a matter of professional pride. "A sad night for the Windermere. Mr. Thorne was a regular visitor these past months, always with questions, always with that notebook of his." Alleyn settled into the conversation with the unhurried grace that encouraged confidences. "He seemed particularly interested in past events, I'm told." "Indeed, sir. Especially that business last summer at Sir Cedric's estate. Asked me who'd been where, what they'd said, as if he were writing a police report rather than a play." Finch's weathered hands smoothed the ledger pages. "He'd found things out, he said. Things that weren't in the official account. The stage door ledger lay open between them, its neat columns displaying the evening's comings and goings in various hands, the decorative flourishes of the self-conscious, the military economy of training, the quick scrawl of perpetual lateness. Alleyn's trained eye noted Vivian Thorne's signature at 5:58, and beside it Finch's careful annotation, Handel 6:17. A package arrived for Mr. Thorne during the interval? A messenger from Bracknell's, sir. Heavy envelope, thick as a prayer book, with a dark wax seal. Might have been a crest, not our sort of thing. Mr. Thorne signed for it, but he looked as if the thing had weight beyond the paper. Alleyn absorbed this intelligence with the quiet satisfaction of a man who recognised significance in small details. And his demeanour afterward? Finch's expression grew thoughtful. Changed, sir. He'd been nervous these past days, jumping at shadows, but yesterday a gentleman came to see him, distinguished fellow, military bearing, silver hair. Spent a good hour in Mr. Thorne's dressing room. Afterward, Mr. Thorne seemed resolved. Said he decided to stand his ground and that the truth must out no matter the cost. The description fitted Sir Cedric Mordaunt perfectly, and Alleyn filed this revelation alongside young Imogen Vale's overheard conversation. The pattern was emerging with increasing clarity, threat, resistance, and finally deadly consequence. In the carpentry shop beyond the fly tower, Mr. Nash stood among his tools with the particular shame of a craftsman whose work had been perverted to deadly purpose. He was thick-set and practical, his hands bearing the honest scars of wood and metal, his eyes holding the affront of one whose materials had been turned against their nature. "The bridge is sound, Inspector," he said before Alleyn had spoken. "You could run an elephant over it. The lamp takes its feed through the handrail tube. Clean installation. If that standard went live, someone wanted it so." "What would such modification require, Mr. Nash?" Nash wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "Strip a bit of neutral wire, lay it against the rail under the velvet binding. Lift the earth connection at the junction box under stage. Time it with the dimmer board, if you know the sequence." He paused, his professional pride warring with reluctant admiration. "Clever work, Inspector. Not artistry, but skill. Someone borrowed your tools during the interval?" "Side cutters went missing from my hook. They were back before Act 2, but they'd been used." Nash moved to his workbench with reluctant precision, revealing a small scrap of black insulating tape adhered to the wood grain. "Found this stuck under the bridge binding when we lifted it. Pocketed it against finding the rest." Alleyn examined the evidence without touching, noting the precise cut that suggested professional competence rather than amateur fumbling. "Who would have access to your tools, Mr. Nash?" The carpenter's mouth closed like a door within a door. "We share back here, Inspector. It was busy during the interval. I didn't see who took them." The loyalty was not antagonism, but something deeper. The protective instinct of those who understood that survival in such hierarchical environments required careful silence. Alleyn thanked Nash and moved on, carrying with him the image of that precisely cut tape and the knowledge that 3 individuals possessed the requisite technical skills. Sir Cedric with his military engineering background, Elowen Gray with her technical training, and Felix Varney with his family connections to theatrical equipment installation. Mrs. Birkett awaited them in the corridor with the patient dignity of one who had observed much and spoken little. "I won't have the innocent dragged into this," she said without preamble. "Miss Vale is all sincerity and no sin, but there are others." She smoothed her apron with hands that had steadied countless nervous performers. Miss Gray came back through the staff corridor during the interval, carrying a small case, the sort electricians use. Said she'd taken a wrong turn, but she knows this theatre better than anyone. "Anyone else behave unusually?" Mr. Varney kept me talking in the scene dock, very eager to help with mending I didn't need help with, and Sir Cedric walked the stage like a general inspecting troops, testing things, the lamp standard, the bridge supports, said it was for safety, but it felt more like preparation. As they returned toward the stage, Alleyn reflected on the evening's accumulating revelations. Vivian Thorne had been more than a playwright seeking material. He had been an investigator pursuing justice for Margaret Thornfield's accident. His play had been intended not merely as entertainment but as exposure, forcing truth into theatrical light. Someone in that carefully civilized company had recognized the threat and responded with the deadly precision that only intimate knowledge of both victim and venue could provide. The technical method was becoming clear. a stripped neutral wire positioned against the lamp standard's metal rail, the earth connection severed, the timing coordinated with the dimmer sequence. It required not only electrical knowledge but detailed familiarity with the production's technical cues, the sort of information available to very few individuals. "The pattern emerges, Fox," Alleyn murmured, as they paused at the stage's edge. Thorne discovered something about the Thornfield incident that threatened someone powerful enough to command silence. His investigation became dangerous when he decided to make it public through his play. The murder was not opportunistic, but carefully planned, a response to a specific threat that could no longer be contained through intimidation. 3 suspects with the technical knowledge, sir, but which had the motive to kill twice? Alleyn's grey eyes settled on the velvet bridge, beautiful and somehow expectant under the harsh worklights. "The motive, Fox, lies in whatever truth Thorne discovered about that summer evening at Sir Cedric's estate. Margaret Thornfield's fall was not accidental, and someone has been very careful to ensure that truth remained buried. The theatre held its secrets still, but the careful observations of those who lived in its shadows had begun to illuminate the deadly precision with which someone had turned art into murder and symbol into weapon." The velvet bridge, designed to represent transformation, had indeed witnessed a crossing, but whether it represented justice served or justice perverted would require all of Alleyn's considerable skill to determine. In his pocket, the matchbook that the night watchman had discovered bore its own testimony. Cream cardstock with an embossed device of halberd and crown, the sort of exclusive marking that declared membership in circles where discretion was valued above truth and reputation above justice. The theatre, having absorbed the shock of sudden death, resumed its rituals with the stubborn propriety of an institution that had witnessed decades of human drama. Inspector Alleyn moved through this revived quiet with the measured attention of one who understood that truth often revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in the small disruptions of routine. The pencil mark where there should have been ink, the letter absent from its appointed place, the fabric brushed against its natural grain. At the prompt corner, where the evening's tragedy had been orchestrated with deadly precision, the callboard bore witness to more than theatrical cues. Phipps had restored order with the mechanical efficiency of a man seeking refuge in familiar tasks. But the cue sheet beneath its protective glass told a more complex story. Against Q47, pearl lamp isolates, 2-beat flicker. The confident blue chinograph strokes were overlaid by a faint graphite addition, where someone had penciled "die" after flicker, then rubbed it out and written it again, the paper bruised with indecision. Young Cullen, the lighting boy, stood beside him, with one hand anxiously at the back of his neck, his youth making his distress particularly transparent. "I mark in blue, sir," he said when Alleyn inquired. "Mr. Harcourt prefers blue for lights, red for sound. Pencil smears under the gel frames, you see." "Yet someone wrote in pencil," Alleyn observed, noting the ordinary graphite implement lying among the specialized blue pencils like an intruder at an exclusive gathering. Too soft, too fine. Artist's quality, the sort set designers favour. The boy flushed with the particular shame of one whose professional domain had been violated. "I went for tea as soon as we were set for Act 2, sir. When I returned, the word was there. Mr. Harcourt said to keep the flicker as marked, so I rubbed out the die, but it keeps showing. Through." Alleyn examined the small violence done to routine, recognising in it the signature of someone who understood theatrical procedure well enough to know exactly where and when to make their deadly alteration. The cue had been changed not by accident, but by design, transforming a harmless lighting effect into the trigger for electrocution. In Vivian Thorne's cramped dressing room, the playwright's obsession revealed itself with uncomfortable clarity. The walls bore not the usual theatrical photographs, but a careful arrangement of documents, newspaper clippings and handwritten notes connected by red thread like a spider's web of investigation. Here was the private workshop of a man who had ceased to be merely an artist and had become something far more dangerous, a seeker of truth in circumstances where truth was unwelcome. The centrepiece of Thorne's investigation was a large photograph of the ornamental bridge at Sir Cedric's estate, marked with careful annotations in various coloured inks. Beside it lay a leather portfolio containing typed statements. Not official police documents, but private interviews Thorne had conducted with household staff present during Margaret Thornfield's accident. The questioning revealed a mind trained not in theatrical dialogue, but in the methodical extraction of reluctant testimony. Most damaging was the statement from Mrs. Pemberton, the estate housekeeper. "Miss Thornfield was not intoxicated, sir, despite what others claimed. I saw her in the garden before the incident, steady on her feet, clear in her speech. She'd been upset about something she'd overheard and was walking to clear her head, not celebrating as some suggested. More intriguing was the testimony of James, the undergardener. I heard voices near the bridge, a man and woman arguing. The woman said something about not keeping silent any longer, and the man replied that some secrets are worth more than conscience. Then there was a cry, and Miss Thornfield was in the water below. A locked drawer in the dressing table yielded Thorne's most private conclusions, a draft letter to the Director of Public Prosecutions requesting reopening of the Thornfield investigation, dated 3 days prior and bearing the notation, "Copy to Sir C.M. Final warning." The attached photograph showed fresh scratches on the bridge's ornamental railing, marks suggesting the ironwork had been deliberately loosened. At the stage door, Finch's discovery proved equally illuminating. The elderly keeper, with the gravity of a sacristan protecting sacred ritual, produced his brass rack for outgoing post. "I clear at 10 on the stroke, Inspector. 3 letters tonight when I looked at 9. Mr. Harcourt to his agent, Miss Vale to her aunt at Streatham, and one from Mr. Thorne. Thick envelope addressed in his precise hand to Margaret Thornfield, Pond Cottage, Mill Lane, Chalcot." The empty slot where Thorne's letter should have rested spoke of calculated intervention. "Gone between 9 and 9:20, sir," Finch continued with evident distress. "Against all proper procedure. The cleaner saw it at 9 exactly, but when Miss Partridge came at 9:20 she noted the rack was one short." Alleyn absorbed this intelligence with the quiet satisfaction of recognising another thread in the pattern. Thorne's final letter to the woman whose fall had inspired his investigation, a letter that someone had deemed too dangerous to reach its destination. On the stage itself, beneath the harsh worklights that revealed every flaw in the theatrical illusion, Alleyn discovered a small detail that spoke of haste or struggle. A single mother-of-pearl button, perfectly round and ornamental, nestled in a fold of the velvet drapery near the bridge's base. It was not functional, but decorative, the sort that might adorn evening gloves or a delicate purse, its back smooth with no thread remnants suggesting it had been torn rather than carefully unfastened. Mrs. Birkett examined the button with professional expertise. "Not ours, Inspector. Too fine for theatrical wear. This is quality, evening dress, I'd say, not the sort of thing you'd find on a stagehand." The button's delicate elegance provided a sharp counterpoint to the utilitarian grit of the stage, a fragment of a different world intruding upon the mechanics of theatrical murder. Alleyn pocketed it alongside the matchbook bearing the halberd and crown device that Finch had identified as belonging to Sir Cedric's exclusive club. When confronted with these items, Sir Cedric maintained his military composure with only the slightest tightening around his eyes. "My club's matchbook, certainly," he acknowledged, examining the embossed crest. "I must have dropped it during the disturbance. One loses track of such trifles in moments of crisis. And the button, Sir Cedric?" The retired general's gaze flickered almost imperceptibly toward where Elowen Grey stood apart from the others, her hands clasped with careful composure. "A charming trifle, Inspector. Perhaps it belongs to one of the ladies." The response carried the weight of suggestion without commitment, the practiced deflection of a man accustomed to strategic communication. Yet Alleyn noted the almost imperceptible stiffening of Sir Cedric's shoulders, the slight compression of his mouth that spoke of information withheld rather than ignorance confessed. In Lady Cosimer's box, where she had retreated with a headache that showed becomingly against her pearls, Alleyn discovered another piece of the puzzle, a stick of dark sealing wax, nearly new, bearing the same halberd and crown device. The wax was soft enough to suggest recent use, its surface bearing the faint impression of a signet ring's pressure. The pattern was emerging with the slow precision of a photograph developing in chemical solution. Vivian Thorne had been more than a playwright seeking dramatic material. He had been conducting a private investigation into what he believed was attempted murder. His play had been intended not merely as entertainment, but as exposure, a theatrical trial designed to force buried truth into the light. Someone in that carefully civilized company had recognized the threat and responded with the deadly precision that only intimate knowledge of both victim and venue could provide. The technical evidence was becoming clear. Stripped wires positioned beneath velvet bindings, earth connections severed with professional competence, timing coordinated with lighting cues known only to those with intimate knowledge of the production. The psychological evidence was more subtle but equally damning. A missing letter, a pearl button torn in haste, a matchbook dropped in crisis, sealing wax recently used for communications that required the gravitas of heraldic authority. As the night deepened, and the theatre settled into the profound quiet that follows tragedy, Alleyn reflected on the careful orchestration that had transformed art into murder. The velvet bridge, designed to symbolize transformation, had indeed witnessed a crossing, but whether it represented justice served or justice perverted would require all of his considerable skill to determine. The performance was not yet complete, and somewhere in the shadows of civilized society, a killer waited to discover whether their final act would end in applause or arrest. The truth lay not in any single revelation, but in the accumulation of small betrayals, routine disrupted, loyalty strained, and the careful facades of respectability cracking under the pressure of exposure. In such cracks, Alleyn knew, murder often made its home, dwelling in the spaces between what people claimed to be and what they truly were. The theatre had settled into that profound quiet which follows the departure of official authority, leaving behind only the essential players in a drama that had moved far beyond the realm of entertainment. Inspector Alleyn stood in the wings where shadows gathered like conspirators, watching Detective Sergeant Fox examine the small leather case that the night watchman had discovered, tucked behind a stack of forgotten programs in the property room. The case yielded its secrets with reluctant precision. A coil of copper wire still bearing the faint warmth of recent handling, side cutters that Nash identified with a grunt of recognition as his own missing tools, and most significantly, a pair of evening gloves bearing scorch marks on the fingertips. Delicate kid leather that spoke of refinement and careful maintenance, their interior showing the ghost impression of initials too worn by time to decipher clearly. "Professional work, sir," Fox observed, holding the wire to the light. "Fresh cuts, precise measurements. Whoever assembled this knew exactly what they were about." Alleyn nodded, his grey eyes taking in not merely the evidence but its implications. The case itself was of superior quality, the sort favoured by those who valued both function and discretion. It had been hidden not carelessly, but with the calculated precision of someone who understood that discovery was inevitable and had prepared accordingly. At the stage door, Mr. Finch awaited them with the gravity of a man whose professional domain had been violated in ways that transcended mere theatrical mishap. "Another irregularity, Inspector," he announced, his weathered hands smoothing the pages of his ledger. "The post-rack has been tampered with. Mr. Thorne's letter to Miss Margaret Thornfield, the one I recorded at 6:17, it's been replaced." The substituted envelope bore the same careful direction in Thorne's hand, yet Alleyn's trained eye detected the subtle differences that marked forgery. A slight hesitation on the capital letters, the faint tremor that suggested copying rather than natural flow. More tellingly, the wax seal bore not Thorne's simple initial but an elaborate device of halberd and crown, the same heraldic symbol they had encountered on Sir Cedric's matchbook. "The original was thick as a prayer book," Finch continued, his distress evident. "This replacement weighs no more than a calling card. Someone has taken considerable trouble to ensure Miss Thornfield receives a very different message than the one Mr. Thorne intended." In the green room, Mrs. Birkett awaited them with a leather-bound ledger that spoke of the theatre's more private business. The careful accounting of favours granted, debts forgiven, and obligations incurred that bound the company together in ways both professional and deeply personal. Her expression carried the weight of loyalty finally overcome by the demands of justice. "Mr. Thorne discovered this 3 weeks past," she explained, opening the ledger to reveal entries that told a story of increasing desperation. Felix Varney's gambling debts were recorded with mathematical precision. Elowen Gray's medical expenses following an accident that had threatened her career. Julian Harcourt's investment losses that had left him dependent on patronage rather than talent. Most significantly, there was an entry for Sir Cedric Mordaunt. Not a debt, but a substantial payment, recent and marked simply as Thornfield matter, discretion assured. "When Mr. Thorne saw this entry, he became quite agitated," Mrs. Birkett continued, her voice heavy with reluctant disclosure. "He'd been investigating Miss Thornfield's accident for months, convinced it was no accident at all. The payment seemed to confirm his worst suspicions." The pattern was emerging with the slow precision of dawn breaking over a complex landscape. Margaret Thornfield's fall from the ornamental bridge at Sir Cedric's estate had not been the result of celebration and carelessness, but of calculation and malice. Her survival had not ended the danger but merely postponed it, forcing those responsible to seek more permanent solutions to the threat she represented. Alleyn examined the ledger entries with growing understanding. The financial pressures recorded here provided motive for desperate action, while Sir Cedric's payment suggested a conspiracy that extended beyond simple self-preservation into the realm of calculated elimination of witnesses. When they returned to the prompt corner, young Cullen stood with obvious distress beside the cue sheet, pointing to alterations that had escaped earlier notice. The original lighting cue had been modified not once but twice, first with the penciled addition of dye after flicker, then with a careful erasure that had left the paper bruised with indecision, and finally with a restoration that suggested someone had reconsidered their method of execution. "The blue pencils are mine, sir," Cullen explained, his youth making his distress particularly transparent. "But this graphite one, its artist quality, the sort set designers favour. And look here, sir, there's wax on the point, the same dark shade as that seal on the letter." The technical evidence was converging with psychological insight to create a picture of meticulous planning executed under increasing pressure. The killer had not merely seized an opportunity but had created one, using intimate knowledge of both the theatre's technical systems and the production's specific requirements to transform art into murder. In the stalls, Sir Cedric Mordaunt sat with military bearing intact, but his face bearing the particular pallor of a man who recognised that his position had become untenable. When Alleyn approached, the retired general looked up with eyes that held neither surprise nor denial, but something approaching relief. "Inspector," he said with quiet dignity, "I perceive that the final act has begun." Lady Cosima appeared from the shadows of the royal box, her usual animation replaced by something approaching resignation. "The evening has taken turns none of us anticipated," she murmured, her voice carrying the particular weariness that follows sleepless hours spent contemplating uncomfortable truths. Julian Harcourt emerged from the wings, his silk scarf perfectly arranged, yet his hands betraying a slight tremor as he lit a cigarette, a habit he had not displayed during the previous evening's festivities. The director's authority remained intact, but beneath his professional composure lay something that suggested his careful orchestrations had been permanently disrupted. Elowen Gray descended from her dressing room with her rehearsal case, its contents arranged with characteristic precision. Yet when she set it down, Alleyn observed that her hands shook almost imperceptibly, and her usual marble composure required visible effort to maintain. She wore different gloves this morning, simple black kid rather than the pearl-buttoned evening gloves that had adorned her performance. The company had reassembled not for rehearsal but for revelation, each member carrying the weight of knowledge that could no longer be contained through silence or misdirection. The theatre, which had begun as a place of artifice and entertainment, had become something far more serious, the setting for a confrontation that would test not only Alleyn's investigative abilities, but the very foundations of the civilized society these people represented. Felix Varney entered last, his casual charm entirely absent, replaced by something approaching panic, poorly concealed beneath theatrical bravado. He moved with the restless energy of a man whose carefully constructed world had begun to collapse, his eyes avoiding direct contact with any of his companions. The velvet bridge, visible through the green room's doorway, waited in the harsh morning light, no longer a symbol of transformation, but a monument to the terrible precision with which civilized people could destroy those who threatened their carefully constructed worlds. The pearl lamp hung motionless above it, its shade askew, casting no light but somehow drawing the eye with magnetic insistence toward the place where Vivian Thorn had made his final crossing. Alleyn surveyed the assembled company with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had gathered all the necessary threads and was preparing to weave them into a pattern that would reveal not merely who had killed Vivian Thorn, but why the playwright's death had been not merely murder, but the inevitable conclusion to a conspiracy that had begun with Margaret Thornfield's fall, and would end only with the complete exposure of the truth that so many had worked so desperately to conceal. The morning light continued to filter through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes and revealing the shabby reality beneath theatrical glamour. But it also illuminated something else, the faces of people who had reached the end of their ability to maintain the facades that had protected them, and who now awaited the final revelation that would transform them from players in a drama into participants in justice. The theatre had settled into that profound quiet which follows the departure of official authority, yet Inspector Alleyn recognised in the stillness not peace, but the taut suspension of breath held too long. He stood in the green room where morning light filtered through grimy windows with a particular clarity that transforms theatrical spaces from places of magic into workshops of mortality, dust motes dancing like suspended secrets in the amber air. Detective Sergeant Fox approached with his customary quiet efficiency, bearing the sort of modest parcels that often contained the most significant revelations. "The messenger service proved cooperative, sir," he reported, with a measured precision that marked his professional competence. "Bracknell's confirms delivery of a substantial envelope to Mr. Thorne at 6:17 yesterday evening. Origin, Lingard and Humber, solicitors of Chalcot. Their senior clerk, when pressed regarding the gravity of our interest, acknowledged the contents as statutory declarations, one sworn by Miss Margaret Thornfield, another by the estate housekeeper at Sir Cedric's property." Alleyn absorbed this intelligence with the quiet satisfaction of a man who recognised the convergence of separate streams of evidence. "Photographs attached?" "Indeed, sir. Recent images of the ornamental bridge showing fresh scratches on the ironwork, dated a fortnight past, alongside documentation of older structural weaknesses. Miss Thornfield's declaration, according to the clerk's recollection, named a person not mentioned in the official account as present during her fall. The implications settled like sediment in still water. Vivian Thorne had not merely harboured suspicions, but had gathered documentary evidence sufficient to reopen an investigation that powerful interests had worked to close. His theatrical exposure had been intended not as artistic interpretation but as legal accusation, forcing buried truth into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. "The technical evidence from the bridge mechanism?" Alleyn inquired. Fox consulted his notebook with the methodical care of one who understood that precision in small matters often determined success in large ones. "Nash's examination reveals professional modification, sir. The neutral wire was stripped with surgical precision and positioned against the lamp standard beneath the velvet binding. The earth connection was severed at the junction box with clean cuts that suggest familiarity with electrical systems. Most significantly, we discovered traces of dark sealing wax on an artist's pencil found near the prompt corner, the same composition as the wax used to forge Mr. Thorne's final letter." Alleyn reflected on the careful orchestration that had transformed art into murder. The killer had possessed not merely motive and opportunity, but the specialised knowledge required to execute such precise sabotage. The list of individuals with the requisite technical competence remained disturbingly short, yet each name carried the weight of careful observation and accumulated suspicion. The telephone in the corridor provided connection to Chalcot, where a competent voice informed him that Miss Margaret Thornfield would receive callers after 3 o'clock, provided they came without theatrical flourish. The journey through winter countryside offered time for contemplation, the rhythmic progress of the train matching the methodical assembly of evidence in his mind. Pond Cottage proved to be what such establishments usually were: tidy resignation wrapped in polished wood and brave flowers wrong for the season. Margaret Thornfield received him with composure that had cost considerable effort, her youth shadowed by experience that aged the spirit while leaving the face deceptively unmarked. A thin line of scar tissue at her hairline spoke of trauma survived rather than merely endured. "Mr. Thorne wrote to me frequently these past months," she said, before he had formulated his first question, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of one who had rehearsed difficult truths. "He believed that if his theatrical exposure failed to achieve justice, I should be prepared to testify formally. He was determined that someone should be brave enough for both of us." "You received his final communication?" Her composure flickered slightly. "An envelope arrived this morning bearing his direction, yet it contained nothing but a blank visiting card. The seal was wrong, too elaborate, bearing a heraldic device he never used. There was also, last week, a different letter containing banknotes without signature. The wax on that envelope bore the same crest, a halberd and crown." The pattern of intimidation and misdirection was becoming clear. Someone had intercepted Thorne's genuine communications while attempting to purchase silence through anonymous payments. The playwright's death had been preceded by systematic efforts to neutralize the threat he represented through both corruption and deception. "On the night of your accident," Alleyn said with careful delicacy, "you were not alone on the bridge." "No." Her response carried the weight of truth long suppressed. "There was an argument, not violent, but intense. I had overheard something earlier that evening, something that suggested the accident to another young woman the previous season had not been accidental. When I mentioned this concern, the person became quite agitated, insisting that some matters were better left undisturbed. They touched my arm as if to guide me away from the subject. I stepped back instinctively. The rail gave way. You remember details of this person? Gloves, smooth kid leather with small pearl buttons. A particular scent, not floral, but something sharper, more sophisticated. And a voice trained to carry, the sort that reaches the back rows of a theatre." She paused, her fingers unconsciously touching the faint scar at her temple. "When I fell, I grasped at the rail and felt one of those buttons tear away in my hand. I kept it, though I could never explain why." The description aligned with disturbing precision to his observations at the Wintermere. The pearl button discovered near the velvet bridge, the scorched evening gloves in the leather case, the careful voice that could project authority or intimacy with equal facility, all pointed toward a conclusion that professional instinct had been suggesting since the previous evening's tragedy. Returning to London as afternoon light faded to that indeterminate colour that marked English transitions between day and evening, Alleyn found the theatre restored to working order yet somehow fundamentally altered. The velvet bridge had been redraped and cordoned with signs forbidding unauthorised contact, transforming the symbol of artistic transformation into a monument to the deadly precision with which human passions could achieve their final effects. Fox awaited him with additional intelligence gathered through the patient application of official authority to reluctant witnesses. "The forged letter has been examined, sir. Blank interior save for the faint impression of a photograph's corner, likely one of the images documenting the bridge's structural damage. The seal is genuine, verified as Sir Cedric's entitlement, though their club porter recalls lending the device last month to a lady for what he termed a lark. The description might serve for either Lady Cosima or Miss Grey, slender, well-dressed, possessing what he called a way of not quite seeing you. The web of complicity was revealing its architecture with increasing clarity. The conspiracy had extended beyond mere financial self-interest into the realm of calculated elimination of witnesses. Margaret Thornfield's survival had not ended the danger but had merely postponed it, forcing those responsible to seek more permanent solutions to the threat of exposure. As evening settled over the Wintermere with the weight of accumulated secrets, Alleyn surveyed the accumulated evidence with the satisfaction of a man who had gathered all necessary threads and was preparing to weave them into a pattern that would reveal not merely a killer, but the complex motivations that had transformed artistic collaboration into criminal conspiracy. The technical method was clear: professional modification of the theatre's electrical system, timed with lighting cues known only to those with intimate knowledge of the production. The psychological landscape was equally illuminated. Financial desperation, social ambition, and the terrible fear of exposure that could drive civilized people to murder. Yet questions remained, not about the identity of the killer, for that was becoming clear through the accumulation of small betrayals and careful observations, but about the precise moment when artistic passion had transformed into deadly calculation. The answer, he suspected, lay not in grand gestures but in the small rituals of theatrical life, where character revealed itself through who maintained order, who disrupted it, and who used it as both shield and weapon. The velvet bridge waited in its pool of harsh work-light, no longer a symbol of transformation but a testament to the precision with which human nature could corrupt even the most innocent of symbols. Tomorrow would bring the final revelation, but tonight belonged to contemplation of the terrible artistry with which murder had been woven into the fabric of theatrical illusion, transforming performance into reality with consequences that no amount of artistic skill could undo. Inspector Alleyn stood in the empty theatre, surrounded by the ghosts of voices and the echo of footsteps that would never again cross the bridge between artifice and truth. The final act was approaching, and with it, the moment when all masks would fall away to reveal the unvarnished reality beneath the carefully maintained facades of civilized society. The morning had settled into that profound quiet which follows the gathering of threads, when evidence arranges itself with the inexorable precision of a theatrical denouement. Inspector Alleyn stood in the green room where dust motes danced in pale sunlight, transforming the shabby space into something approaching sanctity. The Windermere Theatre had become more than a venue for entertainment. It had evolved into a courtroom where truth would be extracted not through legal procedure, but through the more subtle arts of psychological observation and patient accumulation of detail. Detective Sergeant Fox entered with his customary quiet efficiency, bearing the sort of manila envelope that often contained the final pieces of complex puzzles. "The technical examination is complete, sir," he reported with measured precision. The lamp standard's modification required not merely electrical knowledge, but intimate familiarity with this particular installation. Most significantly, we discovered additional evidence in the property room, a leather case containing tools and materials that tell a very specific story. Alleyn examined the case's contents with the methodical attention that had served him through countless investigations. The copper wire had been cut to precise measurements, the side cutters bore Nash's identifying marks, and most tellingly, a pair of evening gloves showed not merely scorch marks, but the ghost impression of initials worn nearly smooth by time and careful handling. The case itself was of superior quality, the sort favoured by those who valued both function and discretion. The pattern emerges. The Morning Post had brought confirmation from Margaret Thornfield's solicitor. His client possessed not merely testimony, but physical evidence that would reopen the investigation into her accident. The pearl button she had clutched during her fall from Sir Cedric's ornamental bridge matched exactly the one discovered near the velvet bridge where Vivian Thorne had died. The pattern was becoming clear with the slow precision of dawn breaking over a complex landscape. "The technical method is established beyond doubt," Alleyn observed to Fox as they prepared for the day's crucial interviews. "Professional modification of the electrical system, timed with lighting cues known only to those with intimate knowledge of the production. The psychological landscape is equally illuminated. Financial desperation, social ambition, and the terrible fear of exposure that can drive civilized people to murder." When Elowen Gray entered the green room, she carried herself with the controlled grace that marked her professional approach to every performance. Yet Alleyn's trained eye detected beneath her marble composure a tension that suggested her self-possession required considerable effort. She arranged herself in the worn velvet chair with fluid economy of movement, her hands resting lightly in her lap with the careful precision of one who understood that every gesture might be observed and interpreted. "Miss Gray," Alleyn began with the courteous authority that had served him in drawing-rooms far more elegant than this, "we have made considerable progress in understanding the events that led to Mr. Thorne's death. I wonder if you might assist us in clarifying certain details that remain elusive." Her contralto voice carried its usual precision when she replied, though Alleyn detected beneath the professional control a note of wariness that had not been present during their earlier conversations. "I am, naturally, at your disposal, Inspector, though I confess that the events of last evening have left us all rather unsettled. The evidence speaks." Alleyn placed the pearl button on the small table between them, where it caught the morning light with deceptive innocence. "This was discovered near the base of the velvet bridge," he said without emphasis. "Miss Margaret Thornfield, in her sworn statement to her solicitor, recalls grasping just such a button during her fall from the ornamental bridge at Sir Cedric's estate. She remembers it being torn from evening gloves, smooth kid leather with small pearl buttons, worn by someone who had approached her during what she initially took to be a chance encounter." Elowen's gaze settled on the button with the sort of professional assessment that actors develop when examining props that must serve specific dramatic purposes. "A theatrical button, perhaps?" she suggested, her voice maintaining its trained steadiness. "The property room contains many such items accumulated over years of productions." "Perhaps," Alleyn conceded with deceptive mildness. "However, Miss Thornfield's recollection extends beyond the button itself. She recalls a particular scent, not floral, but something sharper, more sophisticated. She remembers a voice trained to carry, the sort that reaches the back rows of a theatre without apparent effort. Most significantly, she remembers the conversation that preceded her fall, words about secrets that some preferred to keep buried. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of fabric as Elowen shifted almost imperceptibly in her chair. Her professional composure remained intact, yet Alleyn observed the slight compression of her mouth that spoke of information carefully withheld rather than ignorance honestly confessed. Technical precision. From his case, Alleyn produced the scorched evening gloves that Fox had discovered in the leather case. These were found hidden in the property room, Miss Gray. The scorch marks on the fingertips tell a very specific story about contact with electrical current under controlled circumstances. The leather itself bears traces of the same sophisticated scent that Miss Thornfield recalled so clearly. He paused, allowing the implications to settle like dust in still air. The modification of the lamp standard required not merely electrical knowledge but intimate familiarity with this theatre's specific installation. The neutral wire was positioned with surgical accuracy, the earth connection severed at precisely the junction that would remain undetected during routine safety checks. Such work suggests either extensive technical training or considerable practical experience with theatrical electrical systems. Elowen's hands, which had remained perfectly still throughout the conversation, now showed the faintest tremor, a detail so subtle that only someone trained to observe human behavior under stress would have detected it. "Many of us have acquired technical knowledge over the years," she said, her voice maintaining its professional precision. "The theatre demands versatility from its practitioners." The web of complicity. "Indeed," Alleyn agreed, producing the stick of dark sealing wax that bore the halberd and crown device. This was used to forge the replacement letter that was substituted for Mr. Thorne's final communication to Miss Thornfield. The club porter at Sir Cedric's establishment recalls lending the heraldic seal to a lady for what he termed a lark, a lady who possessed what he described as a way of not quite seeing you, a phrase that speaks eloquently of a particular stage presence. The morning light continued to filter through the grimy windows, illuminating not merely the physical evidence but the careful architecture of deception that had been constructed around Margaret Thornfield's accident and Vivian Thorne's subsequent investigation. The pattern was emerging with increasing clarity, a conspiracy that had begun with attempted murder and had culminated in successful homicide when other methods of silencing inconvenient truth had proved insufficient. Mr. Thorne had gathered statutory declarations, photographs and witness testimony that would have reopened the official investigation into Miss Thornfield's fall, Alleyn continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of accumulated evidence. His play was intended not merely as entertainment but as exposure, a theatrical trial designed to force buried truth into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Elowen's marble composure showed its first visible crack, a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the strain of maintaining facades under increasing pressure. Vivian was passionate about his work, she said, the words carrying a weight that extended far beyond their surface meaning. Sometimes passion can lead one to see conspiracy where others might see coincidence. The moment of recognition. Yet someone took his suspicions seriously enough to commit murder, Alleyn observed, noting how her gaze had unconsciously moved to her own hands, now clasped with careful precision in her lap. "The technical evidence is clear, Miss Gray. The method is established beyond doubt. What remains is to understand the human motivations that transformed artistic collaboration into criminal conspiracy." The silence stretched between them like a bridge over dark water, each aware that they had reached the moment where truth could no longer be contained through evasion or misdirection. The theatre around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the revelation that would transform performance into reality, with consequences that no amount of artistic skill could undo. Through the green room's doorway, the velvet bridge was visible in the harsh morning light, no longer a symbol of transformation, but a monument to the terrible precision with which civilized people could destroy those who threatened their carefully constructed worlds. The final confrontation was approaching with the inexorable momentum of classical tragedy, and Inspector Alleyn recognized in Elowen Gray's carefully controlled features the face of someone who had reached the end of her ability to maintain the facades that had protected her. The morning light revealed not merely the shabby reality beneath theatrical glamour, but something far more significant. The moment when all masks would fall away to reveal the unvarnished truth beneath the carefully maintained facades of respectable society. The denouement was at hand, requiring only the final, gentle pressure that would transform suspicion into confession and performance into the stark reality of justice served. The morning light had transformed the Windermere Theatre from a place of artifice into something approaching a courtroom, where truth would be extracted not through legal procedure but through the more subtle arts of accumulated evidence and patient observation. Inspector Alleyn chose to conduct this final interview upon the stage itself, beneath the velvet bridge where Vivian Thorne had made his last crossing, surrounded by the company whose carefully maintained facades had finally cracked under the pressure of exposure. The assembly of truth. Sir Cedric Mordaunt sat in the front row with military bearing intact, his hands resting on his walking stick with the particular tension of a man who recognised that his position had become untenable. Lady Cosima occupied a seat slightly apart, her usual animation replaced by something approaching resignation, a stick of dark sealing wax visible in her gloved hands, evidence of complicity in the conspiracy that had grown far beyond its original intentions. Julian Harcourt stood near the prompt corner with his silk scarf perfectly arranged, yet his hands betrayed the slight tremor that suggested his careful orchestrations had been permanently disrupted. Felix Varney had positioned himself in the shadows, his casual charm entirely absent, replaced by the restless energy of a man whose carefully constructed world had begun to collapse around him. Elowen Gray entered last, moving across the stage with the controlled grace that marked her professional approach to every performance. Yet Alleyn's trained eye detected beneath her marble composure a tension that suggested her self-possession required considerable effort. She took her position near the velvet bridge with the dignity of one who understood that the final act was about to begin. Detective Sergeant Fox stood at the back with his customary quiet efficiency, the manila envelope he carried containing the accumulated evidence that would transform suspicion into certainty, performance into the stark reality of justice served. The technical method revealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alleyn began with the courteous authority that had served him in drawing rooms far more elegant than this, "we have established the technical method by which Mr. Thorne died. The lamp standard was modified with professional precision, a neutral wire stripped and positioned against the metal rail beneath the velvet binding, the earth connection severed at the junction box. The modification was timed with the lighting cue to produce a fatal electrical discharge when the pearl lamp dimmed to black." He paused, allowing the implications to settle like dust in still air. Such work required not merely electrical knowledge but intimate familiarity with this theatre's specific installation and the production's technical requirements. The list of individuals with such competence is disturbingly short. From his case, he produced the scorched evening gloves that had been discovered hidden in the property room. These bear scorch marks consistent with handling live electrical components. They were found alongside the tools borrowed from Mr. Nash and the copper wire used in the modification. Most significantly, they match exactly the description provided by Miss Margaret Thornfield of the gloves worn by her assailant during her fall from the ornamental bridge at Sir Cedric's estate. The financial conspiracy. The motive for Mr. Thorne's murder lay not in artistic disagreement but in financial desperation, Alleyn continued, his grey eyes taking in each member of the assembled company. The theatre's private ledger reveals a complex web of debts and obligations that bound several of you to Sir Cedric's generosity. Mr. Varney's gambling debts had reached critical proportions. Mr. Harcourt's investment losses had left him dependent on patronage rather than talent. Miss Gray's medical expenses following a career-threatening accident had created financial pressures that threatened her professional survival. Sir Cedric's military composure showed its first crack, a slight tightening around his eyes that spoke of information he had hoped would remain buried. "Inspector," he said with quiet dignity, "I provided assistance to members of the company who faced temporary difficulties. Such arrangements are not uncommon in theatrical circles." "Indeed," Alleyn agreed with deceptive mildness. "However, your generosity carried certain expectations regarding discretion about matters that might prove embarrassing to persons of standing. When Miss Thornfield threatened to expose these arrangements, she became a danger that required management." The confession. Elowen Gray stepped forward with the fluid economy of movement that marked her as unmistakably professional. When she spoke, her contralto voice carried a different quality, as if the theatrical projection had been stripped away to reveal something more fundamental beneath. "Margaret Thornfield was young and idealistic," she began, her gaze fixed on the pearl button that Alleyn had placed on the prompt corner table. "She had discovered the financial arrangements that kept several of us afloat, and she was determined to expose what she termed corruption in the arts. She confronted me during Sir Cedric's house party, full of righteous indignation about payments that appeared in ledgers without corresponding services. Her professional composure cracked slightly as the confession continued. I approached her on the ornamental bridge to reason with her, to explain that some truths cause more harm than their concealment. She was adamant that principle mattered more than consequence. When I touched her arm to emphasize the seriousness of our situation, she stepped back instinctively. The rail, weakened by weather and neglect, gave way. "Yet you made no immediate attempt to summon assistance?" Alleyn inquired with careful neutrality. "I was paralyzed by the implications," Elowen admitted, her voice now barely above a whisper. "Margaret's survival meant that our conversation would be reported, our arrangements exposed, our lives destroyed. In that moment of crisis, I chose self-preservation over moral obligation." The escalation to murder. When Mr. Thorne began his investigation, you recognized the threat he represented? Elowen's hands, which had remained perfectly still throughout the conversation, now betrayed the faintest tremor. Vivian was relentless in his pursuit of what he considered justice for Margaret. His interviews with household staff, his examination of the bridge's structural damage, his correspondence with Margaret herself, it was clear that he would not abandon his investigation until the truth was fully exposed. She looked toward the velvet bridge, beautiful and somehow expectant under the harsh worklights. His play was intended not as entertainment but as exposure, a theatrical trial designed to force buried truth into the light. I had trained as an electrician before I became an actress. The theatre demands versatility from its practitioners. I understood the lamp's mechanism, the vulnerabilities of the system. The modification was not intended as a mere warning. Elowen's eyes met Alleyn's directly, holding a depth that transcended mere theatrical performance. I told myself the surge would be brief, the pain sharp enough to shatter his resolve. But I lifted the earth connection completely, Inspector. I knew what I had done. Vivian would have taken my life from me in the only way that mattered. I took his from him in the way that could not be undone. The web of complicity. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Sir Cedric rising with the deliberate precision of a man who had trained himself for difficult moments. "I will make my statement," he announced to the assembled company, "about last summer's incident, about the payments made to ensure discretion, about a conspiracy that began with good intentions and ended in murder. It is time we ceased protecting reputations at the cost of truth." Lady Cosima's voice carried the particular weariness that follows the abandonment of long-maintained pretense. "I assisted with the forged correspondence," she admitted quietly. Sir Cedric feared that direct communication might prove inflammatory. "I thought to spare Miss Thornfield a public confrontation. I did not know it would lead to this. Justice and dignity." Detective Sergeant Fox moved forward with neither haste nor hesitation, his presence transforming the theatrical space into something grimly procedural. Elowen Gray observed his approach with the composure of one who had expected this moment since the previous evening's tragedy. "Inspector," she said with quiet dignity, "may I change from these rehearsal clothes? I am not one to be taken away in stage costume." "Of course," Alleyn replied with a courtesy that marked his approach to even the most serious circumstances. "Mrs. Birkett will accompany you. 10 minutes, Fox." Mrs. Birkett stepped forward with the practical compassion that had sustained her through decades of theatrical crises. "Come along, love," she said, the endearment carrying the weight of genuine affection despite the circumstances. Elowen moved toward the bridge because there was no other path to the dressing rooms, and because it was, in its artificial fashion, appropriate. Her hand did not approach the pearl lamp as she passed beneath it, crossing from the world of performance into the reality of consequence with the same grace she had brought to every role. The final reflection. When they had gone, Alleyn stood with the remaining company in a silence that had changed its quality. It was no longer the hush of fear or calculation, but the space left when a performance has concluded, and the audience struggles to separate artifice from truth. The velvet bridge waited in the harsh morning light, no longer a symbol of transformation, but a monument to the terrible precision with which civilized people could destroy those who threatened their carefully constructed worlds. The theatre, which had begun as a place of artifice and entertainment, had become something far more serious, a courtroom where justice had been served not through legal procedure, but through the patient accumulation of truth and the gentle erosion of facades that could no longer bear the weight of deception. Inspector Alleyn reflected on the evening's revelation with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had gathered all necessary threads and woven them into a pattern that revealed not merely a killer, but the complex motivations that had transformed artistic collaboration into criminal conspiracy. The performance was complete, the final curtain drawn, and all that remained was the long process of determining whether justice served could ever truly balance the scales against justice delayed. The morning light continued to filter through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes and revealing the shabby reality beneath theatrical glamour. But it also illuminated something else, the recognition that even in the most civilized of societies, the distance between performance and reality was often no greater than the space between intention and action, between the roles people played and the truths they were willing to kill to protect. The particular quiet that follows the completion of justice had settled over the Windermere Theatre, transforming it from a place of artifice into something approaching a courtroom where verdicts were delivered not through legal proclamation, but through the patient accumulation of consequence. Inspector Alleyn stood in the wings where shadows no longer concealed secrets, but merely gathered dust, watching Detective Sergeant Fox complete the methodical procedures that would transform theatrical tragedy into legal documentation. The dignified departure. Elowen Gray returned from her dressing room with the composure of one who had accepted the inevitable transformation from artist to prisoner. She wore a simple black dress that lent her the appearance of mourning rather than guilt, her hair arranged with the same careful precision she brought to every performance. Mrs. Birkett accompanied her with the protective compassion that had sustained her through decades of theatrical crises, carrying a small valise that contained the few personal items permitted during the formal proceedings. "I am ready, Inspector," Elowen said, her contralto voice carrying neither defiance nor self-pity, but something approaching relief. The marble composure that had marked her professional persona remained intact, yet beneath it lay a weariness that spoke of burdens finally set down after months of careful concealment. Fox approached with his customary efficiency, reading the formal caution with neither haste nor ceremony. Elowen listened with the grave attentiveness she had once brought to directors' notes, her hands resting quietly at her sides. When the formalities were complete, she turned to face the assembled company with the dignity of one delivering a final curtain speech. "I ask only that you remember Margaret Thornfield in your thoughts," she said, her voice carrying to the back rows with the projection that had served her throughout her career. "She deserved better from all of us. Inspector, please ensure she knows that my confession was not merely legal necessity, but genuine remorse." The departure proceeded with the quiet ceremony that marked official procedures when conducted by those who understood that justice required dignity as well as law. At the stage door, Elowen paused to look back at the theatre that had been both sanctuary and downfall, her gaze settling on the velvet bridge visible through the open doors. Then she walked between the constables with the same grace she had brought to every stage entrance, disappearing into the grey morning light that transformed London's streets into corridors of consequence. The varied forms of justice. Sir Cedric Mordaunt remained in the front row with military bearing intact, yet his face bore the particular pallor of a man who recognised that honour, once compromised, could never be fully restored. His statement to Fox had been delivered with the precision of one addressing a court-martial, sparing himself none of the words that belonged to charges of conspiracy and intimidation. The payments made to ensure discretion, the pressure applied to silence inconvenient witnesses, the systematic corruption of truth in service of reputation, all were acknowledged with the stark honesty of a soldier facing the consequences of strategic failure. "I shall resign from every board and committee," he announced with quiet authority, his walking stick clicking against the theatre's worn boards with the rhythm of final decisions. "My clubs will receive my withdrawal before evening. It is time I ceased protecting my position at the cost of others' lives." The retired general's admission carried the weight of understanding that his justice would be neither imprisonment nor public trial, but the slow, inexorable erosion of everything he had valued most: respect, influence, and the quiet authority that had defined his post-military existence. His punishment would be exile from the circles that had given his life meaning, a form of social death more devastating than any legal sentence. Lady Cosima occupied her seat with the particular stillness that follows the abandonment of long-maintained pretense. The stick of dark, sealing wax lay before her like evidence of complicity she could no longer deny. Her assistance with forged correspondence, the lending of heraldic seals for what she had termed harmless deception, had revealed a woman whose desire to avoid scandal had led her into conspiracy with murderers. "I thought to spare everyone a public confrontation," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of one who had discovered too late the cost of choosing convenience over conscience. "Instead, I facilitated tragedy. My charitable work, my social obligations, they will continue, but I shall no longer presume to lead them. Some mistakes require permanent humility." Julian Harcourt stood near the prompt corner with his silk scarf perfectly arranged, yet his hands betrayed the tremor that suggested his careful orchestrations had been permanently disrupted. His financial vulnerabilities, exposed through Mrs. Birkett's ledger, painted him as a man whose artistic integrity had been compromised by economic desperation. While he had not participated directly in murder, his silence regarding Thorne's investigations had made him complicit in the playwright's isolation. "The production will not continue," he announced to the remaining company members, his voice carrying the authority of one making final artistic decisions. "Under the circumstances, it would be more than inappropriate. It would be obscene. I shall complete my contractual obligations elsewhere, but I suspect my reputation for discretion has been permanently altered." Felix Varney emerged from the shadows with the restless energy of a man whose carefully constructed charm had finally failed him. His gambling debts, documented with mathematical precision in the theatre's private ledger, had made him dependent on Sir Cedric's generosity, and therefore complicit in the conspiracy of silence surrounding Margaret Thornfield's accident. "I knew nothing of the threats against Thorne," he insisted, his casual manner entirely absent. "My debts were legitimate losses, my dependence on Sir Cedric's assistance purely financial. But I understand that ignorance chosen is complicity earned. I shall find other stages, other patrons, if any will have me." Margaret Thornfield's vindication. The telephone connection to Chalcot brought news that completed the circle of justice with quiet satisfaction. Margaret Thornfield's voice carried the particular steadiness of one who had finally seen truth acknowledged after months of enforced silence. "Inspector," she said, her words crossing the distance with clarity that spoke of relief long deferred, "I am prepared to testify regarding the events at Sir Cedric's estate. The physical evidence you've gathered, combined with Miss Grey's confession, should be sufficient to reopen the official investigation. Mr. Thorne's death must not be allowed to silence the truth he died attempting to expose." Her statement would provide the foundation for prosecuting not merely Eloan Grey's calculated murder, but the conspiracy of intimidation that had protected those responsible for her own attempted killing. The pearl button she had clutched during her fall, the testimony of household staff who had been pressured into silence, the photographic evidence of the bridge's deliberate sabotage, all would finally receive the official attention they deserved. "There will be compensation, of course," Alleyn assured her, "though I suspect the recognition of truth matters more than financial remedy." "Indeed," she replied with quiet dignity, "I was never seeking wealth, Inspector, merely acknowledgement that what happened to me was neither accident nor my fault. That acknowledgement has now been achieved." The theatre's transformation. The Wintermere Theatre had acquired the profound quiet that follows the departure of drama, when truth has been extracted from its careful hiding places and lies, exposed to the unforgiving light of investigation. The morning sun streamed through grimy windows with particular clarity, transforming the space from a venue for entertainment into something approaching a memorial to the deadly precision with which human passions could corrupt even the most innocent of symbols. Mrs. Birkett began the process of restoration with practical efficiency that had sustained her through decades of theatrical crises. "We'll need to strike the set," she announced to the remaining stagehands, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact authority of one who understood that life continued even after tragedy. No point leaving it to gather dust and uncomfortable memories. The velvet bridge, which had begun as a symbol of artistic transformation, now stood as a monument to the terrible ingenuity with which civilized people could destroy those who threatened their carefully constructed worlds. The pearl lamp hung motionless above it, its shade askew, casting no light but somehow drawing the eye with magnetic insistence toward the place where Vivian Thorne had made his final crossing from suspicion to certainty, from investigation to vindication. The striking of the set. Nash directed the dismantling with the careful attention to detail that had marked the bridge's original construction, his weathered hands guiding the removal of each component with something approaching reverence. The velvet drapery came away in careful folds, revealing the honest metal framework beneath the theatrical illusion. The pearl lamp descended in a cradle of canvas, no longer a symbol of enlightenment but a reminder of how light itself could be perverted into an instrument of death. Careful with the metalwork, Nash instructed his assistants, though his voice carried more than professional concern. It's evidence still, and it deserves proper handling. Something beautiful was made ugly here. No need to compound the damage with carelessness. The flymen worked with unusual quiet, their customary banter replaced by the subdued efficiency of those who understood they were dismantling more than scenery. Each rope, each pulley, each carefully balanced counterweight spoke of the technical precision that had made murder possible, transforming the honest mechanics of theatrical illusion into the deadly apparatus of premeditated homicide. As the bridge sections were lowered to the stage floor, Alleyn observed how the removal of each component seemed to restore something of the theatre's original innocence. Without the velvet drapery and pearl lamp, the metal framework revealed itself as merely structural, honest in its function, and free from the symbolic weight that had made it a weapon. The empty stage. When the last component had been carried to storage, the Wintermere stage stood empty under harsh work lights that revealed every flaw in the theatrical illusion. Dust motes danced in the still air, disturbed by the morning's activities but settling now into patterns that spoke of conclusion rather than continuation. The space that had witnessed passion and performance, artifice and murder, had been restored to its essential nature, a platform waiting for the next story to unfold upon its honest boards. Alleyn remained alone in the empty auditorium, surrounded by the ghosts of voices and the echo of footsteps that would never again cross the bridge between artifice and truth. The case was complete, justice served through the patient accumulation of evidence and the gentle erosion of facades that could no longer bear the weight of deception. Alleyn's final reflection. The inspector reflected on the evening's revelations with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had gathered all necessary threads and woven them into a pattern that revealed not merely a killer, but the complex motivations that had transformed artistic collaboration into criminal conspiracy. The technical method had been clear from the beginning: professional modification of electrical systems, timed with lighting cues known only to those with intimate knowledge of the production. The psychological landscape had proved more complex, revealing how financial desperation, social ambition, and the fear of exposure could drive civilized people to murder. Yet what struck him most profoundly was not the mechanics of the crime, but its essential tragedy, the way in which Elowen Gray's genuine artistry had been corrupted by circumstances beyond her control, leading her to use the same technical skills that had served her theatrical career to commit the most untheatrical of acts. She had been both mentor and murderer, artist and killer, the same hands that had guided young Imogen Vale through her first professional role, having modified electrical systems with deadly precision. The theatre, which had begun as a place of transformation and enlightenment, had become a courtroom where truth was extracted not through legal procedure, but through the more subtle arts of observation and deduction. The performance was complete, the final curtain drawn, yet the questions it raised about the distance between performance and reality, between the roles people played and the truths they were willing to kill to protect, would endure long after the velvet was folded and the pearl lamp stored away. As he rose from his seat in the empty stalls, Alleyn considered that the last word belonged not to him, but to the theatre itself, to the honest boards that had supported both artifice and truth, to the patient walls that had witnessed the full spectrum of human nature, from the sublime to the murderous. Outside, London continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the small drama that had played out within these walls, yet somehow enriched by the knowledge that even in the most civilized of circumstances, truth would eventually find its way to the light. The morning had ended as it must, not because the world had chosen justice, but because, this once, justice had chosen to be admitted. In the faintly lit street beyond the stage door, Alleyn turned up his collar and walked into the grey London morning, carrying with him the satisfaction of a case concluded and the sobering recognition that human nature contained depths that no amount of civilization could entirely fathom or control. The velvet bridge was gone, but the crossing it had represented, from innocence to experience, from deception to truth, from performance to reality, would remain as a reminder that in the careful observation of human behaviour, all the world truly was a stage, and all the men and women merely players in dramas far more complex and consequential than any playwright could devise. The final curtain falls. 3 weeks after the tragedy at the Windermere Theatre, Inspector Alleyn found himself once again within its hushed confines, though the space had been transformed by absence rather than presence. The velvet bridge was gone, its components carefully stored in the property room like relics of a concluded drama, and the stage lay bare under harsh worklights that revealed every flaw in the theatrical illusion. He stood in the empty stalls, his long hands resting on the worn plush of an aisle seat, contemplating the curious way in which justice had manifested itself through various forms of consequence and recognition. The Old Bailey had concluded its proceedings with the particular solemnity that marked cases where truth emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence and the gentle erosion of carefully maintained facades. Eloan Gray had received her sentence with the same dignity she had brought to every performance of her career, 15 years for murder, delivered with neither defiance nor self-pity, but with something approaching relief. Her final statement to the court had been brief and precise. I ask only that Margaret Thornfield knows my confession was not merely legal necessity, but genuine remorse. Justice in its various forms. Sir Cedric Mordaunt had not lived to see the trial's conclusion. His body had been discovered in his study 4 days after Eloan's arrest. A service revolver beside him, and a letter that spoke of honour compromised beyond redemption. The coroner's verdict of suicide had surprised no one who understood the particular code by which military men of his generation measured their worth. His final communication, addressed to Margaret Thornfield, had contained both confession and a banker's draft sufficient to ensure her comfort for life. A gesture that spoke of conscience awakened too late to prevent tragedy, but not too late to acknowledge responsibility. Lady Cosima had withdrawn from public life with the quiet efficiency that marked those who understood that some mistakes required permanent humility. Her charitable work continued, but from the shadows rather than the spotlight, her name appearing on subscription lists but never on committees. Julian Harcourt had found employment with a provincial company where his reputation for discretion had been transformed from asset to liability, his artistic authority permanently compromised by the financial vulnerabilities that had made him complicit in the conspiracy of silence. Felix Varney continued his restless pursuit of patronage, though his casual charm now masked a deeper unease. The gambling debts that had made him dependent on Sir Cedric's generosity served as a permanent reminder that survival in theatrical circles required more than talent. It demanded the sort of integrity he had never quite managed to develop. Margaret Thornfield's vindication. Margaret Thornfield had used Sir Cedric's posthumous compensation to establish a foundation for young women in the theatrical profession, those whose careers had been threatened by circumstances beyond their control, who faced the choice between compromise and abandonment of their artistic aspirations. The foundation's first beneficiary had been young Imogen Vale, whose earnest sincerity had been rewarded with proper training and the sort of patronage that asked nothing in return except honest effort. From Dover, where she had taken a position with a small touring company, Margaret had written, "The money cannot restore what was taken from me, but it can prevent others from facing the same impossible choices that led to such tragedy. Mr. Thorne's investigation, which cost him his life, has achieved its ultimate purpose, not merely the exposure of guilt, but the prevention of future victims." The theatre's renewal. The Windermere had reopened with a new production, a comedy this time, something light and inconsequential that would allow audiences to forget the darker dramas that had unfolded upon its stage. Mrs. Birkett remained as wardrobe mistress, her practical compassion serving a new company that understood the weight of performing in a space where art and murder had intersected with such deadly precision. The Velvet Bridge itself had been donated to a theatrical museum, where it would serve as an exhibit illustrating the technical innovations of early 20th century stage design. The pearl lamp accompanied it, no longer a symbol of enlightenment but a reminder of how even the most beautiful objects could be perverted into instruments of death when human nature revealed its darker possibilities. Alleyn's final reflection. As afternoon light filtered through the theatre's grimy windows with the particular clarity that marked English autumn, Alleyn reflected on the case that had revealed so much about the complex motivations that could transform artistic collaboration into criminal conspiracy. The technical method had been clear from the beginning: professional modification of electrical systems, timed with lighting cues known only to those with intimate knowledge of the production. The psychological landscape had proved more complex, revealing how financial desperation, social ambition, and the fear of exposure could drive civilized people to murder. Yet what struck him most profoundly was not the mechanics of the crime, but its essential tragedy, the way in which genuine artistic talent had been corrupted by circumstances beyond individual control, leading to the use of professional skills for purposes that violated every principle those skills were meant to serve. Alleyn Gray had been both mentor and murderer, artist and killer, the same hands that had guided young performers through their first professional roles, having modified electrical systems with deadly precision. The case had concluded not with triumph, but with the sobering recognition that human nature contained depths that no amount of civilization could entirely fathom or control. Justice had been served in various forms, legal for Alleyn, self-imposed for Sir Cedric, social for the others, yet each form carried its own weight of consequence and recognition. The enduring symbol. As he prepared to leave, Alleyn paused at the edge of the stage where the velvet bridge had once stood. The space seemed somehow expectant, as if waiting for the next story to unfold upon its honest boards. The bridge had been designed as a symbol of transformation, a passage from one state to another. Instead, it had become a conduit for death, a stage for murder that was both meticulously planned and deeply personal. Yet perhaps, in its dismantling and preservation, it had achieved its original purpose after all, serving as a bridge between deception and truth, between the roles people played and the reality they were willing to kill to protect. The theatre, for all its artifice, had merely provided a setting for truths as old and stark as humanity itself. Detective Sergeant Fox appeared at the stage door, his presence a reminder that police work continued even after individual cases achieved their resolution. Together they walked into the grey London afternoon, leaving behind the empty theatre with its ghosts of voices and echoes of footsteps that would never again cross the bridge between artifice and truth. The performance was complete, the final curtain drawn, yet Alleyn carried with him the knowledge that in the patient observation of human behaviour, every ending was merely the prologue to another beginning. The velvet bridge was gone, but the crossing it had represented would endure as long as people gathered to tell stories, create art and discover in the process both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human frailty that made such achievement both precious and perilous. In the distance, London continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the small drama that had played out in its theatrical precincts, yet somehow enriched by the knowledge that, even in the most civilized of circumstances, truth would eventually find its way to the light, not because the world chose justice, but because occasionally justice chose to be admitted into the careful choreography of human affairs.